Episode 15. But to make matters worse, it was crossed and crisscrossed with curious banks or dikes, which sometimes divided it up into squares and oblongs. Now, all these, of course, had to be climbed. They varied from 2 to 5 feet in height and were a couple of yards thick. On the north side of each bank, the snow already lay in deep drifts, and after each climb, you came down into a drift and got wet. Fighting her way forward with hood up and head down and numb hands inside her cloak, Jill had glimpses of other odd things on that horrible tableland. Things on her right that looked vaguely like factory chimneys, and on her left a huge cliff, straighter than any cliff ought to be. But she wasn't at all interested and didn't give them a thought. The only things she thought about were her cold hands and nose and chin and ears and hot baths and beds at Harfang. Suddenly, she skidded, slid about 5 feet, and found herself, to her horror, sliding down into a dark, narrow chasm, which seemed that moment to have appeared in front of her. Half a second later, she had reached the bottom. She appeared to be in a kind of trench or groove, only about 3 feet wide. And though she was shaken by the fall, almost the first thing she noticed was the relief of being out of the wind, for the walls of the trench rose high above her. The next thing she noticed was, naturally, the anxious faces of Scrubb and Puddleglum looking down at her from the edge.
"Are you hurt, Pole?"
shouted Scrubb.
"Both legs broken, I shouldn't wonder,"
shouted Puddleglum. Jill stood up and explained that she was all right, but they'd have to help her out.
"What is it you've fallen into?"
asked Scrubb.
"It's a kind of trench, or it might be a sunken lane or something," said Jill. "It runs quite straight." "Yes, by Jove," said Scrubb, "and it runs due north. I wonder, is it a sort of road? If it was, we'd be out of this infernal wind down there. Is there a lot of snow at the bottom?"
"Hardly any.
It all blows over the top, I suppose. What happens further on?"
"Half a sec. I'll go and see," said Jill. She got up and walked along the trench, but before she had gone far, it turned sharply to the right. She shouted this information back to the others.
"What's round the corner?"
asked Scrubb. Now it happened that Jill had the same feeling about twisty passages and dark places underground, or even nearly underground, that Scrubb had about the edges of cliffs. She had no intention of going round that corner alone, especially when she heard Puddleglum bawling out from behind her,
"Be careful, Pole. It's just the sort of place that might lead to a dragon's cave. And in a giant country there might be giant earthworms or giant beetles."
"I don't think it goes anywhere much," said Jill, coming hastily back. "Well, I'm jolly well going to have a look," said Scrubb. "What do you mean by anywhere much, I should like to know?"
So he sat down on the edge of the trench. Everyone was too wet by now to bother about being a bit wetter, and then dropped in. He pushed past Jill, and though he didn't say anything, she felt sure that he knew she had funked it. So she followed him close, but took care not to get in front of him. It proved, however, a disappointing exploration. They went round the right-hand turn and straight on for a few paces. Here there was a choice of ways, straight on again or sharp to the right.
"Well, that's no good," said Scrubb, glancing down the right-hand turn. "That would be taking us back south."
He went straight on, but once more in a few steps they found a second turn to the right. But this time there was no choice of ways, for the trench they had been following here came to a dead end.
"No good,"
grunted Scrubb. Jill lost no time in turning and leading the way back. When they returned to the place Jill had first fallen in, the Marshwiggle with his long arms had no difficulty in pulling them out. But it was dreadful to be out on top again. Down in those narrow slits or trenches, their ears had almost begun to thaw. They had been able to see clearly and breathe easily and hear each other speak without shouting. It was absolute misery to come back into the withering coldness. And it did seem hard when Puddleglum chose that moment for saying,
"Are you still sure of those signs, Paul? What's the one we ought to be after now?"
"Oh, come on, bother the signs," said Paul. "Something about someone mentioning Aslan's name, I think, but I'm jolly well not going to give a recitation here."
Now, as you see, she had got the order wrong. That was because she had given up saying the signs over every night. She still really knew them if she troubled to think, but she was no longer so pat in her lessons as to be sure of reeling them off in the right order at a moment's notice and without thinking. Puddleglum's question annoyed her, because deep down inside she was already annoyed with herself for not knowing the lion's lesson quite so well as she felt she ought to have known it. This annoyance, added to the misery of being very cold and tired, made her say, "Bother the signs." She didn't perhaps quite mean it.
"Oh, that was next, was it?" said Puddleglum. "Now I wonder. Are you right? Got 'em mixed, I shouldn't wonder. It seems to me this hill, this flat place we're on, is worth stopping to have a look. Have you noticed—"
"Oh, Lor," said Scrub. "Is this a time for stopping to admire the view? For goodness sake, let's get on."
"Oh, look, look, look!" cried Jill and pointed. Everyone turned and everyone saw. Some way off to the north and a good deal higher up than the tableland on which they stood, a line of lights had appeared. This time, even more obviously than when the travelers had seen them the night before, they were windows. Smaller windows that made one think deliciously of bedrooms, and larger windows that made one think of great halls with fires roaring on the hearth and hot soup or juicy sirloins smoking on the table.
"Harfang!" exclaimed Scrub.
"That's all very well," said Puddleglum, "but what I was saying was—"
"Oh, shut up,"
said Jill crossly. "We haven't a moment to lose. Don't you remember what the lady said about locking up so early? We must get there in time. We must! We must! We'll die if we're shut out on a night like this."
"Well, it isn't exactly a night, not yet,"
began Puddleglum, but the two children both said,
"Come on,"
and began stumbling forward on the slippery table-land as quickly as their legs would carry them. The Marshwiggle followed them, still talking, but now that they were forcing their way into the wind again, they could not have heard him, even if they wanted to. And they didn't want. They were thinking of baths and beds and hot drinks, and the idea of coming to Harfang too late and being shut out was almost unbearable. In spite of their haste, it took them a long time to cross the flat top of that hill, and even when they had crossed it, there were still several ledges to climb down on the far side. But at last they reached the bottom and could see what Harfang was like. It stood on a high crag, and in spite of its many towers, was more a huge house than a castle. Obviously, the gentle giants feared no attack. There were windows on the outside wall quite close to the ground, a thing no one would have put in a serious fortress. There were even odd little doors here and there, so that it would be quite easy to get in and out of the castle without going through the courtyard. This raised the spirits of Jill and Scrub. It made the whole place look more friendly and less forbidding. At first, the height and steepness of the crag frightened them, but presently they noticed that there was an easier way up on the left, and that the road wound up toward it.